Sharon.
Okay, thank you. I'm Sharon Heal. I'm the director of the Museums Association, but I'm here today in my capacity as one of the founders of the Space Invaders network. So welcome to our webinar. I'd like to begin by giving a big thank you to the Space Invaders team for setting this up, especially Polly and Babs, who have been amazing, pulling some very rebellious women together into order and putting a programme and technology in place for today. And welcome to all of you. Thank you for tuning in. We've got over 100 people at this webinar. We can't see all of you, but hopefully you can see and hear us. Please do mute and turn videos off if that's not already been done on entry. I would say we're recording the speakers at this event as a record of the event, and just a little bit of housekeeping. If you tweet, please use the hashtag #Manifesto to tweet about today's event. Use the chat box to ask questions in the question and answer session. We've got a full programme, so buckle up, it's going to be a blast. This is the official launch of our manifesto, but we've also got lots of other content, brilliant speakers, and of course, naturally, a bit of workshopping. But I was going to start with a couple of minutes about values-based leadership, how it connects to feminism and why it matters. Clearly, we are living through exceptionally challenging times. I think that means we need to explore, find and work to our values now more than ever. At Space Invaders, we've been looking at feminist leadership and what that means. Now, let's be right, we don't always agree on that, but I think we're in the same ballpark. So what is feminist leadership? There is probably as many definitions of it as there are feminists, but for us, it coalesces around 3 points. One is about the distribution of power, not taking power from others or holding power to yourself, but looking out for those with less power than ourselves and those with less power in society, and also sharing resources and capacity with transparency and honesty. The second point is about creating a culture of mutual care. That might sound obvious, but actually claiming the right to self-care is a radical act, and it's one that's needed now more than ever. And then the third one is thinking about why you lead. Leadership is a means to an end, not an end in itself. I don't think any of us are in it for the power dressing, and in museums we're certainly not in it for the money. Often workplaces can be really competitive, inflexible, authoritarian, hierarchical places, and they're not driven by the human potential for fulfillment. As feminist leaders, we say it doesn't have to be that way. And these are our 5 top tips for finding your values and being a feminist leader. The first is to practice what you preach, formally and informally. So that's about shaping workplaces and policies that place value on employees, ensuring that everyone feels respected and valued, and building diverse and inclusive spaces and workplaces. The second is a really interesting one about redefining success. The measure of what a good employee is has been traditionally how hard we're willing to work and what sacrifice we will make. And also in museums that we're expected to do it all for the love of it. But feminist leadership, we think, is about measuring success differently. It's about looking at where a team has worked well together and delivered, where different voices have been brought in and heard and respected, and where getting the day-to-day tasks done is celebrated at the same level as those big one-off projects. The third tip is about sharing power and credit for work. I think often workplaces are driven by competition. We compete against our colleagues, but feminist leadership for us is about valuing everyone's contributions and putting the outcome before the ego. So that means feminist leadership is about sharing authority and making decisions collaboratively. And that leads on to the 4th tip, which is about building community and relationships. We're good in museums at building networks, and feminist leadership is about building that community and forming relationships and building bonds with our potential allies. And the 5th tip is about mentoring and empowering your team at every level. Often good leaders aren't self-taught. They've been mentored and empowered by their colleagues and their peers, and they've shared their experiences generously. And again, that's something we're prepared to do in the museum sector. So remember, we all have something to give in that context, every single one of you who's in that webinar today. So on those top tips, I'm going to hand over to Sara Wajid, who's going to take over the next part of the webinar.
Hi everyone, my name tag says Fotani because my pal Fotani Aravani just got me out of a tech jam, but my name is actually Sara Wajid. So although it looks like that, a bit of solidarity right off the bat there, and a bit of comedy, tech, mild tech disaster to set the tone. I'm part of the Space Invaders collective, and I want to spend just a couple of minutes setting the scene and telling you a little bit about who we are, how we got here, and why this is a good moment for us to be having this conversation. We came together probably about 5 years ago, in a slightly haphazard way, in that some of us were on a program together around women and leadership. And we quite quickly realized that piecemeal interventions and one-off programs that support individual women were not going to give us the systemic change that we wanted to see around dismantling patriarchy. And so after kind of wringing our hands about this for a little while, we quite quickly moved on to thinking about, well, what can we do? We've been given this incredible opportunity and platform to come together as women and think about this. This is an incredibly rare opportunity given to us by the Women Leaders Network who set up the program. And so we started thinking and talking, and partly thinking about other models that we've seen in the sector, like Museums Muck and Museum Detox, about how we needed to really make a collective effort to do this. So several things have happened, and many of you have been involved in those and part of making them happen, from conferences to workshops to manifesto writing to reading and thinking and mentoring, and lots of things have been happening. One of the key things that have happened is that we collaborated with Nirmal Puwar, and who in turn started working with Siobhán McGuirk on a massive research project. At the first conference that we ran at the Imperial War Museum that 150 people attended, Nirmal gave a talk, and she's a sociologist, I'm going to introduce her in a minute later, but it was really kind of based on her ethnographic work that she'd done around women in different spaces, and the book that she wrote called Space Invaders, and that's where our name comes from, Space Invaders. So it's been a long journey since then, since we heard from really significant thinkers who had done a lot of kind of economic analysis on women in the workplace, legal frameworks, labour rights, all of those things. And so here we are now, and about 2 months ago I had a conversation with some of the women in that original cohort that we were part of, and they were talking about how during this lockdown they'd seen gender norms in their own families return aggressively, like retrogressive gender norms, where previously they'd been sharing roughly equally domestic kind of responsibilities with their most of them with their male partners. Suddenly in lockdown they found themselves saddled with what felt like 1950s type of models of kind of female responsibility for the home, totally disproportionate, and it got them reflecting on how this has been actually playing out in smaller ways all through their careers. And now suddenly they were finding it incredibly depressing, basically, to see that all of this work can get dismantled so quickly, all of these kind of progressive norms that they thought they'd established. Around that time, I had a really interesting series of conversations on Twitter, because I've been talking to my coach, Gayleen Gould, an incredible woman who had supported me to reflect more and more on internalized sexism in myself, blocks that I was putting up for myself in terms of thinking about my own career progression and potential. So I kind of put this question out there on Twitter to see whether what I'd heard from recruitment consultants, that women didn't seem to be putting themselves forward for the big jobs, the major jobs, whether this was really true to people's experience or whether it was just another myth around gender and power. And quite quickly I started getting back incredible responses from the sector. And I just want to give you a flavor of a couple of those. So I put out there that, like, is it true that women don't go for the big jobs? Have you gone out for the big jobs? And if you haven't, why not? What's your experience of your own career progression and your own job searches? This one from Jackie Kiley, former curator at the Museum of London, really stood out to me. She said, more needs to be done on actively encouraging women to go for senior jobs. Internally, organisations should be helping with confidence building and mentoring. Too often assumptions are made about people, even by ourselves. Phrases like, I'm not good enough, I'm not clever enough. At the moment, there are 3 directors that I know of national museums who have never had a job before in a museum. Literally their first job was to be a director of a national museum. All of those people are men. I don't know of any women who are running museum or heritage organisations who have never previously held a museum job. No matter the fact that the museum workforce in the UK and often internationally is predominantly a female workforce, we are still not seeing women proportionately represented on boards of museums or in the very top paying jobs and in those top power broking national museum jobs. And I still think we couldn't really call our sector currently an effectively feminist workforce, an effectively feminist sector, but we have an incredible opportunity here with such a huge array of incredible feminist leaders, and we need to grasp this moment. These moments don't come that often, and you know, this is a moment of change. This is a moment where we can really deeply kind of start to reconfigure how we want to run our sector. I'd like to sort of give you one of the more hopeful and positive things I heard on that Twitter conversation, which was a comment from Farhana Begum, who runs St Albans Museum. She said, I recently went for a big gig and I got it. I almost talked myself out of it, almost talked myself out of even applying for it, as I didn't think I was there yet. I thought that kind of job was something I could do in 10 years' time, not now. My thinking at that time was that I just hadn't earned it. And that's sort of, that I just found that so inspiring to hear from Farhana, that, you know, she had those feelings, which I found so common on the Twitter thread and from talking to women around the sector. But you know, she fought through it, and she recognized there was a lot of internalized sexism going on there, and through a lot of support and solidarity, particularly of other women, she kind of forced herself to apply for that big job, and she got it. So now, as time is moving on, I want to introduce our first speakers. You are Nirmal and Siobhán. Nirmal is the author of Space Invaders, Race, Gender and Bodies Out of Place. And she's been a member of the Feminist Review editorial collective since 2000. She's a senior lecturer in sociology at Goldsmiths University, and she's been, her work has been a key influence on us at Space Invaders, and she's been a great ally through this process. She's working with Siobhán McGuirk, who's a postdoctoral researcher on the Global Grace Project in the Department of Anthropology at Goldsmiths. She's also an editor and columnist for Red Pepper magazine, and they're now going to give you a presentation about their work researching women museum workers.
Great, everyone. Hi, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the lovely introduction. And I think we're going to be speaking back to and relating to a lot of the points that have already been raised. Just want to make sure that, first of all, Nirmal is also able to speak right now. Are you there, Nirmal?
I'm able to speak, but I've turned psychedelic, yes.
Okay,
so I think there's the technologies playing with us today.
Okay, well, I'm going to share my screen and we'll start a slideshow that we'll go through, so you'll hear both Nirmal and I speaking. It looks like you need to enable, the host has disabled attendee screen sharing. So would you be able to enable my screen sharing? Wonderful, thank you. Great, so I'll just dive straight in. You've already know who we are. So just very quickly to give you a little bit of background, we have been conducting research throughout 2018 and 2019, primarily with senior women working in museums, but not only, across a range of positions in the sector. We've done lots of interviews, we authored a survey, and we've had some discussion forums, and have been using ethnographic research to kind of supplement our interview findings. And we're going to be publishing and analysing, we're analysing our findings now, and we're going to be publishing them over the next 2 years. So just to give you a little bit of an insight into our research aims, for us, coming at this as feminist sociologists, feminist anthropologists, we recognise the importance of personal experience, and we want to give space for people to be able to share their experiences. So we did use a survey, but our focus is on letting people speak freely and getting into that richness of detail. We do that because we want to recognise the complexities and tensions that are inherent in people's experiences. And that means that we are ultimately not thinking about prescribing recommendations or giving you kind of, these are our very conclusive findings, or telling you what to do with them, but really creating space for conversation and creating space for change, however that might look within different networks or within different institutions, or maybe even across the sector as a whole. One of the key things that has come up in our research is this question of places and spaces and conditions of impossibility or possibility. And so what we're thinking about there is, how are the structural but also individual conditions, what are those that facilitate some people, but not all people, to achieve highly? And Sara's already kind of referenced some of those. They can be internal, but they can also be structural. So am I applying for the job? Will I get the job? And those are influenced by so many different features of our lives, from qualifications, experience, background, the way we talk, the way we look. And those are things that Nirmal's going to really focus on a little bit later on. We see those possibilities and impossibilities not as straightforward. As I said before, we're interested in the complexities and the tensions here. And so sometimes one condition of possibility might run into a sudden space of impossibility, and pathways or routes towards a high level position, or even a position, paid position within a museum, might suddenly be cut off. We've been very attentive to space and time. So not only in the sense of, I should say, we've been attentive to space and time. And one thing that has really come forward in our research is the number of times that people have said, I've got to where I am because I was in the right place at the right time. And thinking about that idea, but also thinking about, well, what did it take, and what maneuvers did people have to take to get to the right place and be somewhere at the right time? And those, of course, are related to conditions of possibility as well. And then we're also thinking about space and time from a kind of more straightforward perspective. So what are the differences when we talk about the museum sector or experience within the museum sector? We're talking about a really huge, diversely structured sector. So your experiences in London or in the Greater London area are very different from other parts of the UK. The size of the museum, the status of the museum, and the sources of funding really have an impact. And we've seen statistically differences in terms of the gender breakdown in these different types of museum and different sizes of museums. And this is also related to time, in the sense of how policy changes or huge restructurings, funding cuts, can suddenly change pathways and routes, opening up or closing down for particular people. And this is a quote that we've chosen from the research that really illustrates that reality. And this is an example of one of our interviewees kind of telling us really straightforward what the reality is, and thinking through about why it may be that some spaces feel more possible for women than others to get through. And I'm just going to pass over to Nirmal now to continue talking a little bit more about our research findings.
So as Siobhán has highlighted for us, there's this absolute imbalance, especially towards the prestigious jobs, the so-called national institutions. We know that they're very more likely to be of certain kinds of masculinity. And Sara was indicating how people can be in those roles without having any museum experience at all. So other factors are coming into play into the recruitment of those positions of leadership. Siobhán? And this quote from one of our participants, we have so many quotes actually. Our struggle is to limit how many we use. This one indicates how class is very dominant in the sector, especially for those so-called prestigious jobs. And pointing towards how the somatic norm almost paints this quote. It says it paints a picture of a leader in very traditional terms. What would they look like? They'd be tall, probably quite good looking, and sound posh, clean shaven. This carries through in a different number of manifestations. So it also produces this dimension we call social cloning, where people of similar types are surrounding the networks, the important institutional positions, and there's an unlikeness. So there's something about that likeness which creates these moments of social intimacy and social promotion. And this quote we've put in the slide in order to just summarize hundreds of years of feminist political theory. Carol Pateman has pointed out that when women did win the right eventually, obviously through stages, to wear the political lion skin, it still seemed to be exceedingly ill-fitting and therefore unbecoming. And we found this to be very, very much apparent in terms of the mismatches of gender scripts. By that, we mean that, for instance, this woman leader pointed that if she sent David, my director of a particular position, to a meeting, he's treated very differently from the way that my female staff are treated. And she was very clear about this. Or one could see it in other ways. For instance, a curator said that often young females may not be seen to be the proper creator, and people, including public, other personnel, especially the public, will ask for the proper curator, and they often think that they expect this curator to be donned in a tweed jacket. And this creates a situation where even when women are in these kind of high-level roles, this word was used quite a lot actually, wrestling, and I think we could sit with this word for quite a while, where they're wrestling gendered job descriptions. So the job descriptions are not just job descriptions, they already come gendered. And this quote summarizes several dimensions for us. We often find that interviewees are great analysts, often better analysts than the analysts actually, and this one does it very well when she says women have to fight harder without showing their boxing gloves, shout louder without appearing aggressive, they are mansplained, and particularly by building contractors. And interestingly, building on what Sharon said earlier, our leader here points at that collaboration and a willingness to be nice and friendly is often seen as a weakness that can be taken advantage of. And she says it's exhausting, frankly. So there's one particular dimension that I actually haven't noticed when I've interviewed other sectors, but I'm sure it's there, but it's been highlighted to me, especially through the interviews that Siobhán collected. It was this notion of possession. We're using this word possession. There seems to be a tendency for men to possess their teams, but also to possess ideas. So this comes through in many ways. For example, if the team has achieved something, there's more likely to be a claiming of it as a personal prize by men. And even though it's an organizational prize, very much in the presence is the personal prize. The personal presence persists. And one of our participants said, perhaps women don't feel under so much pressure to personalize success. And another said, perhaps it's easier for women to efface themselves than it is for men to efface themselves. And this dimension takes on particular force when it comes to very big ideas. So big strategic ideas, planning ideas, big creative ideas, ideas that have potential to make big changes, a big splash, generate change. And we found that the big ideas are very much embodied, so very much linked to somatic norm. And even if it's women who have put the seeds of those ideas there, who have spurred this movement of thinking and change, very easily the idea can become disattached from them and attached to men. And this especially happens in the institutions when younger, and I thought it was quite, interesting, younger white 40-year-old men are able to step in. This was stated many times to us, that when they step in, they're able to just carry an idea, and they're able to own a project which was started by someone else, by a woman, maybe by a woman who was much older, much more senior, much more experienced. And then this 40-year-old, the somatic norm, is able to, next slide please, is able to sort of be a kind of guy who is not ready to grow into the role. They're not in the role, they're not showing all the competencies, but they are able to grow into the role. So I think this is an important difference that we need to sit with as well. Who is able to show potential and who is able to grow? And the women tend to not to have that capacity enabled for them. They have to come more than laden with all the skills, but that's why here it's stated that we don't get allowed to grow into the roles. And we found that there's a bit of a, in all organizations, there's snakes and ladders in motion. So at the beginning we mentioned that there are certain routes and trajectories, and it's not a linear pattern often. Especially for women in terms of organizational achievements. But organizational atmospheres, this word is something we're going to do some work with us as well. The atmospheres can change very easily, and it's rather like the weather, that it can change, especially with a change of personnel. People can feel demotivated, undermined, forgotten, and left to the side, stepped over. So this is something that actually presents itself in quite painful way for women as well.
Great, and just for the last few minutes, and to building on those insights, I want to just talk about what the implications of our research are, particularly in the current moment, or in light of recent events, in terms of resilience, and this idea of resilience being a key trait that leaders need. So resilience discourse is something that's been very common, and I'm sure so many people on this call have been familiar with it. You might have done a course or workshop with resilience in the title. This is from an interview of a woman director of a museum who told me that you have to be tough to get there and stay there as a woman, and use the word herself, you have to be very resilient. So this has been something that's been built into Arts Council England, particularly projects for the last decade or so. So in a focus group, people were talking, women talking about looking back on their careers as they approached retirement, or as they moved out of the sector by choice or by force. And they reflected a lot on the idea of resilience and maybe the limitations of it. And it was flagged to me that we don't make enough space for people to say, actually, this is extremely painful. And we can't always be resilient, and we're always showing that we're resilient, and that's actually a huge pressure. I think it's important that we recognize the downsides then to this narrative. This was from the same conversation in which someone told me that, again, not by choice, but after being made redundant, that they really had a physical mental collapse. They'd, as Sharon said at the beginning of our session today, putting so much passion and dedication into a role and then losing it can be absolutely devastating. A particularly poignant example of this devastation is when talking about racism in the sector. Someone we were interviewing, a black woman we were interviewing, told us that even though she had tried and really tried to cope with the racism that she'd experienced regularly in her institution, that she just still hadn't managed to cope with it. The impact of that chipping away is that people leave the museum sector, particularly BAME people, particularly people who do not feel that they are recognised and their contributions are appreciated within the sector, not because they've failed to be resilient, but because that constant chipping away has had a lasting impact on them. I think it's really important that we therefore say that a huge downside to the resilience discourse is that it can obscure the realities, the structural realities that mean that some people are not able to bounce back, never mind bounce forward, because of the conditions in which they're working. This is another example of that. I'm mindful of the time, so I just want to highlight here that this is someone who is saying they want more diversity in their workplace, but they're not going to risk that being at the cost of someone's well-being. And so how can networks contribute to this, or how can networks be a source of addressing some of the issues that we've raised in our short presentation today? I'm just going to run through these quite quickly. I think first of all, let's start with something that Sara said at the Museums Association a few years ago, that detox started as a survival necessary rather than an act of dissent. And we can think about that in terms of the women leaders in museum network, but also other networks. I'm sure you can think of the ones that you're part of that have started because conditions were such that people needed to do something just to survive, never mind to thrive. These were the conditions in which the Women Leaders in Museum Network was set up in the 90s. Recognizing that if you needed to create new networks because you were being excluded from the informal ones that existed. But that was responded to with a sense of threat. And so actually very negative responses when the WLMN was initially setting up, with it being made light of. And one of the people who was telling us about that experience in the early days of the network was that they realized that men didn't even recognize that they were part of networks because it was so natural to them to feel a sense of belonging. They didn't need to help each other up. And what have these networks achieved? Well, incredible things. And Space Invaders, I think, can count themselves among these networks that have achieved incredible things for women in the sector, from peer support to pushing for policy changes that sees things happen like the National Museum Directors Council expand and suddenly higher visibility of women directors, changing conversations, keep pushing to change policies. And is that visibility of women leaders potentially, to have potential, and has it changed the semantic norm, is a question that we want to leave you with. But thinking, just as I wrap up, on the realities of coronavirus and lockdown and what networks might be doing differently now and might have to do differently looking forward, is thinking about, as Sara's raised already, the realities of gender dynamics, not only in the home, but in the workplace coming to the fore. So some of you might have been engaging on Twitter to try and keep museums visible or unlocked during lockdown. It's important to think about how material conditions and gendered realities dictate who has caring responsibilities that eat into their time to be able to do that, who has a robust, stable internet connection, who has a quiet place in the home to be able to make time to be online and participate in events even like this tonight. We've got to think about not only who will survive and thrive post-lockdown, but just who will survive. And I think Museum Detox have done a wonderful job and very quick job of saying we need to support each other because the reality of this lockdown is economic and is falling disproportionately on people of colour and women across the sector. And so maybe now it's time to think of networks and the task of networks less as creating ladders for individuals to climb higher within the sector, but to provide safety nets for people who are maybe not able to, or being forced out to but who would like to achieve highly in the sector. And I'll leave it with that question. Thank you so much for your time.
Brilliant, thank you. Sorry if there's a bit of background noise. I did the risky thing of going outdoors for this, and maybe that wasn't entirely wise. Anyway, I've also slightly messed up the running order. I was actually supposed to start with Dr. Orian Brook and then go to Siobhán and Nirmal and their questions. So apologies, Orian, for you might have been expecting to be on earlier. Now we're going to hear from Dr. Orian Brook. Her research focuses on social and spatial inequalities in the creative economy, with a focus on how space and class interact in explaining both cultural participation and creative careers. She's one of the authors of the seminal report Panic: Social Class, Taste and Inequalities in the Creative Industries. And just before I hand over to Orian, can I ask you to be thinking of questions, because we're going to have more like maybe 7 minutes after this slot for questions for our speakers, which I'll chair, hopefully less cat-handedly. Over to Orian.
Hi, Sara.
If you could put your questions in the chat.
Now, hold on, how am I doing this? If I put that on, okay, so everyone can see me. Could everyone see me and hear my slides?
We can see you, and you need to share your slides.
Okay, I did it through there.
Unless you want me to do it.
Okay. I've done this before, but now I need to.
Little green arrow at the bottom of the screen.
Oh, share screen. There we go.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay. That one. Yes. Share. Done. Right. Great. So yes, thank you so much. I was really honoured to be invited to be part of this launch. I really hope that this research is something that people will feel some affinity with or recognise aspects of, and such an important initiative. And there's so much that Siobhán and Nirmal were talking about, and indeed Sara, about the importance of it. And so I'm going to share a bit about some research that I've been involved with, looking at women in cultural work, basically. And the larger research project is about this kind of paradox in the creative economy of how, on the one hand, it's supposedly so egalitarian, and indeed you look at the professed attitudes of people working in the sector, and there's this sort of, very belief in meritocracy and the freedom from rigid social norms and so on. And yet increasingly, if you look at the makeup of the creative workforce, it's marked by very strong race, class and gendered exclusions, which also then obviously has an impact on the sort of culture that we are presented with, and therefore what society has to in terms of cultural consumption. In terms of gender, the sort of position that I'm coming from here is obviously that the presentation and the research I'm going to talk about here is very much about parenting, which isn't to say that the only issue is parenting. Clearly, there's a massive area of sexism which has nothing to do with motherhood, and to say that it's about motherhood then makes it about childcare as a sort of easy fix, which is not the case, as I think I'll sort of go on to demonstrate. However, I do believe that, and in the research we did suggested that there is an association between women and parenthood and parenting responsibilities, which affects how all women are viewed as creative workers, and it affects them whether or not they are in fact mothers, and it affects them and their career choices and how they are viewed and valued in the workplace, regardless at all kind of life stages, and whether or not they in fact have children. And there are various reasons for incompatibility between parental responsibilities or mothering and this and sort of creative work. There's the sort of chronic insecurity and the individualized risk of creative work. There's this expectation of this sort of passionate, exclusive engagement with your work, and that you will be always available. There's particularly an issue about spatial concentration in London and the affordability of London, particularly for family accommodation. And if you choose to relocate, what that does to networks, and the importance of personal networks and personal relationships within, particularly because of the precarity situation, and how those can be really impossible to repair if you take a career break or you relocate. So very quickly, I'm just going to slide through this quantitative study, which was using census data, using the longitudinal study of England and Wales, based on census data, linking census responses of individuals, a 1% sample of individuals chosen through according to their birthdays. But what this shows is through 3 different cohorts, up to 3 different cohorts, depending on their age group, that between their 20s and 30s, women were certainly much less likely than men to still be in their creative job 10 years on. If you look at women and men in their 20s in creative jobs, and then you look at what they were doing 10 years later, they were much less likely to still be in that creative job. So there's a big loss of women from the workforce at that crucial stage for family formation. And this loss was much, much smaller when you looked at people going from their 30s to 40s and their 40s to 50s. And this affected people born from 1953 to born to 1982. And you also found that women were much more likely simply to be out of work. Again, women observed in their 20s being in a creative job versus men. In this case, in the oldest cohort, people born between 53 and 62, 0% of the men were not in creative jobs. 0% of men in creative jobs in their 20s were not in work 20% 10 years later, whereas over 20% of women were. Now that difference was smaller in following cohorts, but it's still substantial. And again, at that crucial time for family formation. So going on to the panic report, which Sara referenced, there was a survey with 2,500 people working in the creative sector, and then from that survey, there were 237 people who were interviewed in a sort of semi-structured interview in quite a lot of depth about various aspects of their creative careers, how they got into it, about their upbringing, about what effect their social background felt they had on their getting in and getting on in creative work. And there was a wide range of different kind of creative work included within the interviews. Interestingly, motherhood wasn't one of the topics. Parenting wasn't one of the topics that was originally in the topic guide, but it's the thing that most obviously spontaneously arose in talking in interviews, inevitably, especially in women. Men were less likely to mention having children, and if they did so, they were less likely to reference it in terms of an impact on their career. It was something that was arose when they talked about their living circumstances or their life history. It didn't mention it in relation to their career, unlike women, and again, looking at women from more privileged backgrounds compared to women from working class backgrounds. Again, women from more privileged backgrounds were more likely to mention having had children, but less likely to mention it in terms of an impact on their career. Or a relationship between their career options and their parenting responsibilities. So looking at some of this in a bit more detail. So one issue, this is a visual artist or someone working in various temporary contracts within visual arts, and how challenging it was not having a steady income. Not knowing where money was going to come from, not having any kind of employment rights, not having maternity pay, all those sorts of things. How challenging it was to plan having a family in that financial circumstance. Again, this is a different woman working in museums, where there was this sense of women kind of disappearing from the workforce, that the senior management, most of the senior management were men, most of the junior staff were women. As we know, the majority of people working in museums of women. And museums, she made the point that museums are very good at offering flexible working and good maternity leave and that kind of thing. And they were therefore seen as good working environments for women. But then, as she was saying, but why is it only women who are requesting flexible work? She felt that, and she's not the only one, but she expressed it particularly well, that there was this sense that women were much more sort of contingent members of the museum workforce, that there was something that they weren't really serious about it, and they were likely to go part-time or likely to leave, and therefore just sort of it was more of a hobby for women in the workforce. And again, an artist talking about how the impact of the fact that a lot of cultural consumption is in people's leisure time, so the evening and weekend work in order to, which was just really incompatible with family family responsibilities. There were some amazing stories of women who working in the performing arts and the lengths they had to go to, or women who worked backstage but who just worked. The first time she was not back. When she got pregnant, she asked for flexible working. She was not back. She lost her job. She managed to get another job later on with 2 kids, and then just worked insane hours in order to manage it. And she had a husband and they could afford childcare and all these sorts of things. Another woman who is a young single mother who was on an acting course with a baby, and was just simply told that she didn't have a place in the theatre because she had a baby, that it was, and in fact she now supports herself as a care worker. And later on she did another acting course. She qualified. She was obviously talented, got an agent who wanted to take her on, but would only do it if she would move to London. And her feeling was, well, I can't afford that. I can't do that as a single mother. I can't afford to bring up a child in London as a single mother. So again, she lost out on a huge opportunity there. A woman working in publishing who, there were several times people talked about the long-term impact of decisions they'd made on when they became a mother, of going part-time, going freelance, leaving London, and how that was necessary or practical choice for in terms of taking on the responsibilities of parenthood. But then when their time became freer, it was very difficult to recover the career that they had. They had to go back to the beginning. They could never build up the same kind of full-time work that they had before. And another thing that was notable was how internalized these women had it as a sort of personal responsibility, that they took on the guilt, they took on the responsibility of trying to balance the motherhood and their professional careers. And this woman who talked about, so she was a musician, and talked about how she left it very late because everybody told her that her career would be over as an artist. And so then she was worried about being an older mother, but about the impact of that on her child. And she felt this obviously terrible kind of personal responsibility for her choices, rather than anger at the context that she was working in that made it impossible. And this is the last quote, but about how the same woman talking about working in a creative team of men and women. The men all had children, and then they had women at home who looked after children while they went to Brazil. And the women who went to Brazil with them were all single, or certainly weren't mothers, and were then looked down upon by the men for being kind of somehow sort of less complete human beings, less to offer as an artist, because they didn't have this experience in their life of parenthood. So in conclusion, the creative career and mothering is challenging, not only because of precarity, but also because of all the other things we talked about, of always being on, about this exclusive passionate engagement. It's not just about a practical solution about childcare, but it actually is. There were many of the women who mentioned motherhood were not mothers, but they were younger women who were talking about their career and thinking, how am I going to manage if I want to have a family? How can I make this career sustainable if I want to have children? And also, again, as we heard, it affects how women are viewed in the workforce, whether or not they have children. And so in conclusion, that we found that motherhood and a successful creative career is impossible, or at least very difficult to combine unless you have the resources to make those or the resources or the willingness to make those responsibilities invisible. So thank you very much. And there was obviously a lot there. I'm very happy to share the slides, so if people want to follow up on any of that. And I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, Orian, you, Nirmal. Thanks, Siobhán. Amazing, rich content for people to digest. We asked you to do so much in such a short amount of space, so thank you for doing it. It was all killer, no filler. There's lots of questions coming in and lots of things on Twitter. We've, as we might have expected, we are not quite running on time, so I'm just going to pick up a couple of key questions that have come through the chat here. I'm going to start with one about age, and I wondered whether, and this could kind of, like, to be honest, any of you could speak to this, but what if anything have you got to say about kind of the middle age, particularly experience for women, and whether that came through in research for yourselves? Orian mentioned something there about women who are thinking about future motherhood, or future parenting. Yeah. Anything you've noticed about women's careers across the age span?
Well, I'll go first just to make it easier. But yes, it did come up. I mean, I had that quote there, but she certainly wasn't the only one. Several women who had stepped back from their careers in order to, when their children were young, and then just had got off the carousel, whatever the right expression is, and they just weren't part of that network anymore. They'd lost their contact. They weren't the person that people called when they needed, whatever X, Y, Z doing. And so yes, people then, a lot of women reported then feeling kind of that they'd lost out creatively, and lost out career-wise in terms of having to make that decision. And on the other hand, there were women who talked about not having had families for precisely that reason, that they couldn't see that they could see the impact that it would have, and they weren't willing to make that sacrifice. So there wasn't I'm not remembering a particular discussion about middle age other than other than to do with parenting, but I was specifically looking at the parenting interviews. So it's not to say that it wasn't there, but I'm thinking of it in terms of parenting. And yeah, those two perspectives came through very strongly.
Thank you.
Do you want me to say very quickly on that, or do you want to move on?
A real quick one, because I want to squeeze in a couple more. Thank you.
So it was kind of told to me very explicitly that women's kind of window of like being a desirable employee, especially in a high position, was very, very narrow. Lots of experiences of ageism, concerns about like just seeing that you kind of, if you're over 50, then you're too old, but if you're under 36, then you fall into the kind of pregnancy risk category, which was the language that someone used to describe to me. And she said that she made clear at an interview that she was not a pregnancy risk, she didn't intend to have children. For men, it was pointed out that men are seen as, they can be a young, up and coming, exciting person, but they can also be seen as an established person across a range of like more like 30 or 40 years, whereas women, it's so narrow.
Thank you. Another thing people are asking is, do you have a sense of museums compared to other sectors? Are we experiencing similar things as people right across the arts and wider, right across society, or are there things that are uniquely shit about the museum sector?
I'll go quickly. I think there are lots of patterns that work across the sector. So certainly in terms of opportunity structures, respect, and how long that you have a longevity, whether it's intellectual or other types of maturity and experience, which becomes embodied in a man, even if he's kind of really not any more efficient, but that stays. There's something quite different about the museum sector. I think it's the precarity of it, and which is even more exacerbated now. precarity of it. And one other factor that's very important, this is similar to academia, it's the passion. Siobhán mentioned the passion. People have this, they're very qualified, very experienced, and they love their jobs. They do love the jobs, but that can lead to lots of forms of exploitation as well. And in academia this happens, but people tend to drop out earlier. But in the museum sector, this carries on, and it takes on different formations. So people might become freelance consultants, juggling so many things because they're so committed to it. But lots of the factors we found in our research with respect to pathways, networks, the somatic norm, these are applicable to other sectors.
Thank you. Sorry, you can probably see my eyes trying to scan Twitter questions and things like that. I think there's a lot of interest in solidarity between women, and the question here of given that it is such a female-dominated sector, are there that should be helping us more? We feel. I think there's just this general sense of like we should be a feminist sector. I meet so many women who identify really strongly as feminists, but somehow we still don't seem to be behaving like a feminist or kind of sector. Could you speak to this a bit more about the question of women's relationship to other women in terms of developing them? I'll just give you one quick little prompt, and this is probably going to have to pains me to say, but this is probably going to have to be the last question, is that Esme Ward was one of the people who responded to the Twitter conversation earlier, this year, and she said, I was at the Whitworth for nearly 20 years. I had 2 kids and amazing support from a female director to develop and lead. That must be Maria Balshaw. I wouldn't have changed that for the world. And quite a lot of women have spoken about this, about the real key transformational experience that they had from other women mentoring them. Quick shout out to Andrea Cunningham from me, and loads of others. Yeah, just on that.
Siobhán, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think there's a number of different factors. One is the pressure to kind of change your style and change your appearance, because the box you're fitting into is so coded as male and a masculine way of working, that there's been some kind of people report to me that they felt that they were treated even more harshly by their women bosses in some cases, because they felt that their women boss didn't want to be seen as favoring other women, and therefore have that kind of count against them. I think it's really important that we think carefully, and it can be a very kind of critical reflection that's needed. But if we're telling ourselves that kind of only this, you have to be really tough, you have to really be tough to stick at this, then it becomes a question of who wasn't tough enough to survive, who wasn't strong enough to survive. And even if we don't want to internalize that, it can be internalized. And so this question of, well, do they really want it? Are they really dedicated enough? Can creep in, even as we're trying to practice solidarity. There's this idea of I made sacrifices, and you can do it as long as you work hard enough. So a young person told me that she was kind of sick of seeing people complaining about the lack of pay in the sector, because in her words, you go into it with your eyes wide open. And so those kind of, they're subtle, but if that's circulating as a sector norm, then how is that internalized and reenacted out? And I think that's can be a big part of it. And I'll just highlight the importance of an intersectional lens, and that the women who have gotten to the top are overwhelmingly white, and so it's thinking about the ways in which the women have needed, maybe, and a lot of people did tell me that they had very supportive male colleagues as well, and that they required their male colleagues stepping back, offering mentorship, giving them opportunities, encouragement. We've got to ask, are white people in the sector doing that enough to women of colour and people of colour more generally?
Yeah, I think that sense of being able to lean on people was really there, because there's so many crises, they're wrestling with so many challenges. You need to be able to pick up the phone, call someone, I'm in this crisis. But alongside crisis management, there needs to be that people need to be held and kind of encouraged to grow, quietly encouraged to grow. Yes, so some people have formal but also informal mentors who actually, the mentors believe in them more than they believe in themselves. You know, they give them challenging questions. People use words like, they give me a kick up the arse to not come in here feeling so happy about everything and to come with your problems so I can sort you out. You know, so it's some people have mentors in a strategic way, where they've had, you know, long-standing mentors, but they need mentoring for certain skills they want to build up or certain problem areas. And it really is a kind of way of being held and a wall that you can go to when everything around you is so heightened, the pressure. So even though you might have, look like a, you know, big battle in front of you, but people are very vulnerable as well. So therefore you need the solidarity.
Thank you. Although, as I say, it pains me. This is such a rare opportunity to hear from you all. The clock just does its thing. So I'm just going to thank you all. I know you can't all stay for the rest of the panel, but I know that we're going to keep you totally part of this conversation. And it's been amazing. Like, Twitter loves you. The audience here has loved everything they've heard and really appreciate just having this stuff said out loud. So much of this stuff is just rattling around our brains in a sort of silent, you know, sort of, it just doesn't, we don't get the chance to say it. So on to Mel Strauss, who's next on the agenda. Mel from Space Invaders wants to tell you about the manifesto.
Hi. Am I all good?
You're all good. I can hear you.
Excellent. Hi everyone, it's great to see you all. Thank you very much for coming. I'm really excited to be launching our manifesto tonight. It feels like we've been talking about it for a long time. Next slide. A few years ago, I took my then 6-year-old daughter to a large art gallery. We were at least halfway around the permanent galleries when she asked, "Are there any women artists here?" I stopped and thought. I went through the names of the artists we'd seen in my head. No, not one. Eventually, we saw one woman represented in the displays, and then 2 women in temporary shows, though one of these was closed for maintenance. I did not enjoy the conversation that followed, and explaining that this paltry number of women is not so rare. Women are severely underrepresented in most of our public collections and exhibitions, as well as commercial spaces. Women are largely missing in our historical records and in the statues and plaques on our streets. But we all know it doesn't stop at the walls or on the display cases. The majority of people running our institutions are men, while the majority working in them are women. And the conditions that they work under can be far from ideal. This matters. Museums and heritage sites do not sit in a vacuum. We reflect our society in the lack of power we afford to women to lead our institutions. We reflect the lower pay and the barriers for carers, who are mostly women. We also have a strong role in narrating our past and influencing how people and events are understood now. We know that too many people think women have played a less important part in history, and we must take some responsibility for these attitudes. Next slide, please. Our first Space Invaders event was a conference held in March 2016. During discussions that day, 3 common themes emerged, which became the basis of our demands. These are equal power and influence, with more women leading our institutions; fair conditions, with day-to-day working life designed to meet our needs; and our stories told, with real representation in collections, narratives, and displays. These demands are built on what you and hundreds of others have told us over the last few years about the issues that women face in the sector and the change that you want to see. So we hope that you feel that you can support and share and to help this manifesto happen. Next, please. So what does the manifesto say in more detail? First, we want equal power. That means equal representation in leadership in museums and heritage. This should reflect the wider population, with women and a diversity of women holding their share of influence. We want to see more women in the top role. And we want more representative governance too. While women make up roughly 40% of museum boards, there are far fewer women chairs. This is not just about numbers though, but also about the style of leadership. We want to see different, more inclusive leadership valued, including more participatory decision-making and more collaborative working. Second, we want fair conditions. That means creating workplaces and conditions that are designed to meet the needs of women. This includes equal pay and no gender pay gap, flexibility with caring responsibilities supported for all staff and all dependents, and safe spaces free of sexism. Finally, we want our stories told. That means seeing women represented in collections, narratives, and displays. Women's history and perspectives should be properly included in all museums and historic sites. Art and design by women should be equally represented in acquisitions and displays. We also want to see wider gender equality issues highlighted through interpretation, exhibitions, and events. There have been some nice examples of this from exhibitions and community projects on things like domestic violence and pregnancy, to interpretation that talks about how women's bodies are portrayed in art. Next slide. So what are we doing? We've developed a draft action plan and we've made a start on addressing some of the demands. Our plan draws on 3 types of activity: gathering and sharing information and ideas, supporting people to create change, and campaigning. So far, we've focused a lot on gathering and sharing information and evidence and ideas. We are working on a knowledge hub on our website that will be a repository for relevant research, articles, and other links. We're trying to create baselines by gathering and analysing data on the makeup of boards and chairs, directors, and conditions, including the gender pay gap. We've supported Nirmal and Siobhán's research to develop a better understanding of women's experiences in leadership roles in the sector. And we're looking at ideas and practice around feminist leadership. This has been a subject at some of our events with speakers, I should say, but primarily this work is focused around a podcast, which we will be launching very soon. The first 2 podcasts we've recorded already, and these are interviews with Adele Patrick from Glasgow Women's Library and Rachel Crossley from the East End Women's Museum. We're also drawing together examples of great representation in collections development, interpretation, and exhibitions, so that we know what good looks like, what we want to see more of. Next, we need to look more at what we do with this information. Part of this is about creating more support for people that want to make change. We will very soon be launching a mentor program in partnership with the Shift group of women leaders. And we're also talking to the organisation Women on Boards about running an event to help women apply for board positions. Finally, we need to think about how we can influence the people that make decisions. How can we use this information to create pressure and campaign for greater gender equality? We've got lots of thoughts, but I'm sure that you'll have plenty of great ideas to add. Next slide. We recently shared this manifesto with a generation of women before us. One of the reflections was about the slow pace of change. We're still asking the same questions decades on. But the kind of museums and heritage sites that I want to hand on to the next generation and my daughter are ones which represent the stories and experiences of women, which are good places for women to work and are run, at least half the time, by women. I hope that you'll consider helping us to speed up the pace of change. Thank you. We're now going to break out into small groups for 15 minutes so that you can share your thoughts and hear from others. The discussion is really about what you'd like to bring to this campaign, what action you'd like to see. We're also interested in any thoughts you have about campaign ideas, potential partners, or existing work that's relevant. You might also want to reflect on what's resonated for you lately, what might have come out around gender politics in the last few months as well. Please choose a note taker for your group who's happy to feed back. We'd be very grateful if you can email these notes to us afterwards. I think we've run out of time to share too much in person. Feel free to add ideas and thoughts to the chat as well. We'll collate your notes and share back. So the main question, I'll just repeat it, it was on the slide earlier. Based on your experience, what do you want to bring to this campaign, and what action would you like to make this change stick? And I think that you'll be sent that in the groups as well. So we'll now, or someone will now press a button, and you should end up in your discussion groups, and then we'll bring you back in 15 minutes. I will start talking anyway. So this final bit is really about what you can do to help, some ideas that we have. So firstly, please share our manifesto, share the conversations and the things you've heard tonight with others, and tell them about what we're doing and what we're trying to do. Anyone that wants to volunteer to help us to gather and share information and data would be very welcome, or just let us know about relevant research or anything that you've seen that you think might be of interest to us and the people looking on our website. You could join a working group, for example, to develop campaigns to support people creating change and create links with existing work. We're thinking about setting up a group for each of the 3 manifesto themes, but we'd be keen to know what you might be interested in working on and following through from there. And finally, you can create a local chapter. We've had lots of interest in our events across the UK, but we're mainly based in London, and most of our events have been in London, except for one in Birmingham. Although we've had lots of conversations with people in other places about running events too. So we'd be happy to support anyone that wants to set up a local group. You can email us at spaceinvaderscampaign@gmail.com to tell us anything that you'd like to tell us, or to volunteer your time or get involved in any way. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mel. And I'm just going to wrap up this session. And the last thing that I saw in the chat was from Pib saying it would be great to develop the manifesto in the Welsh language. Absolutely, we'll be on that and get a Welsh language version. So I think it has been a really brilliant, stimulating discussion. It's absolutely fantastic to have academic research opening up some questions for us, but also supporting our experiences. So I'd like to thank all the panelists very much, and also thank all of you for taking part. You're absolutely amazing for giving up some time to come together in this network. It's really interesting to hear the conversation expand from gender into class and into race. A headhunter that works in the sector once apparently described me as being a good candidate but a little bit rough around the edges, which I take to be a comment on class and accent maybe. But we obviously will face more challenges and struggle ahead, not just because of the systemic discrimination that many of us face, but also because of the pandemic, which we're still battling with in society. So we're going to need to use our networks and to use our advantage, actually, as women and as feminists and as those that are getting organised. And I want to finish with 2 quotes from women who the breakout rooms were named after. The first is from Angela Davis, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, and that is that I am no longer accepting the things I cannot change, I am changing the things I cannot accept. And the second you may be less familiar with is from Jaya Ben Desai, who was one of the Grunwick strikers. And she said, commenting on the place that she worked, to the boss, "What you're running here is not a factory, it is a zoo. But in a zoo, there are many types of animals. Some are monkeys who dance on your fingertips, others are lions who can bite your head off." So I guess that's what I take with me from some of the women fighters and feminists that went before, that we need to be lion-like, and we can do that. So watch out for our next steps. Meanwhile, stay safe, stay radical, stay feminist. Thank you.